Good evening, IL family, and welcome back to your Inclination Life broadcast here with Coach Timiel / Lady Timiel, where we talk about positive living via simple truths. So I'm continuing our quality of life series with a conversation tonight on defining boundaries. I believe that in life we all need boundaries, and this is not only important to our state of well-being, but it also helps us to love people better. It also helps us to be our best selves so that we can be the best that we can be for others. So when we think about boundaries, there's two big things that we're focusing on here, because we're focusing on a quality of life. We're focusing on a state of being, and defining boundaries gets us to a place where we have a degree of happiness. If you look up the definition of happiness, it means a state of being happy. So this is not a feeling. This is not an emotion. This is a place where we know it to be called joy. And when we have joy that no one can move, no one can take it away, no one can do anything with it. And so, when think about that on tonight, a state of quality, having a great quality of life, boundaries help us get to that place where we keep our joy, where we keep our peace, where we keep all of those things that are good and they're great and they're going for us. And so, when we look at quality of life, if you know about companies that do quality inspections, or if you own your own business, I hope you're doing quality inspections. If you think about quality, the only way that you really know that when you do a quality check is there is a standard that's set, and it says that you have to meet the standard in order for you to pass the quality test. So in your life, what is the standard? How do you measure? How can you look at your life and reflect and say, hey, it's meeting the standard? Now, I know on tonight for me that as a believer, I go to the Bible and I look at the standard. I look at what God has said for our lives. I look at what God has spoken in our lives and what he has said that we should have as believers. And I look at my life and I see, is the standard being met? Are those things in our life that should be, in my life that should be, those things like love, joy, peace? Are those things in there? The fruit of the Spirit, or the love that not only is being shown to me, but more so the love that I'm able to give out as a reflection of knowing who I am in him. Those are some of the standards that I meet. The beautiful thing about going at this method as a believer is that if you go to God for your standard, if you go to Christ as the model for your life, is that now you have a standard that you're not comparing into anything that can be diminished. You're not comparing to anything that can be set by man. And because we know that as individuals, we have so many different standards, so many different thought processes, that if we solely rely on what other people thought, we might be living beneath the standard for our lives. We may be living beneath the boundaries that should be set for our life. So one way that we can set boundaries on tonight is that we can lean in on what it is that God has set for us in boundaries. There are some places in our life that God has just said, this is the boundary, don't cross the line. And he says, I've done it for your good. I've done it so that this is for the betterment of you. I've done this because I love you. And then there are so many other places where that line, that boundary line, has to be set based on who you are, based on where you are, based on the definition of your personality, your walk, where you're at, your purpose, where you're being driven in life. There are still yet so many boundaries that you have to take ownership of. And so in looking at that on tonight, boundaries are considered a line that marks the limits of an area, a dividing line. And when we think about this, we can think about the fact that when we set boundaries, not only do those boundaries keep things out, but they also keep us in a set parameter. And so when we define our boundaries, when they're clearly defined, then it determines our standard of life. It determines our quality of living. And then I put here, it doesn't mean that all days will be perfect. So we might think, okay, I set boundaries and things are not going to come into my life that I don't want there. Things are not going to be there that shouldn't be there. But there are going to be days when things creep in that shouldn't be there. There are going to be things that happen in your life that you can't plan for. But your boundaries are there to kind of send you off the warning signals that, hey, something has entered in that shouldn't be here, that I'm in a place that I shouldn't be. I'm maybe in behaving in a way that I shouldn't be. I may be participating in actions that don't line up with the standard that is set for my life. There are several reasons that we need boundaries. And these three are, one can be that if you don't set boundaries, people can take your kindness, the lack of having a boundary for weakness. And therefore, even though everybody is not coming in with a determination that they have a malicious intent, they still may cross boundaries in your life because their boundaries for their life is defined very differently than the way that you define boundaries for yourself. And so in saying that, when you set boundaries for yourself, you let people know what's your line in life and what's the line that they cannot cross, and vice versa. They do the same thing for you. If you ever think about two people, one touchy-feely and one that's not, if the touchy-feely person doesn't know that this person does not like people in their personal space, a touchy-feely person is automatically going to reach in. They're going to get close because this is how they show love. This is how they express themselves. And if you never say anything, you're sitting there uncomfortable because you've never communicated that that's a boundary. You never communicated that this is a space that I don't want you in. Hey, that I need to have my space here. And so in saying that on tonight, I want to say in the same thing in all places of your life. There may be a person that handles things differently in life, but if you don't define the boundaries, then they will not know that they are crossing a boundary in your life. And so they sometimes will take your lack of saying anything or your going along with what it is that they're doing to mean that, hey, that must be your boundary too. The second thing is, I put here, absolute overload. See, when we let people into our lives and we begin to allow their voices to speak over into our lives, their opinions, their definition of what life should be, to come over into our territory because we have not clearly marked the line. What we do is we let the thought process of that person dictate our lives, and a lot of times that can be overload. It can be overload because maybe they're dictating your schedule. It can be overload because maybe they're trying to tell you how to think. It can be overload because maybe they're trying to get you to do everything that they want done or need to be done because you're not saying anything. You got to speak up and you got to clearly define your boundaries. The other thing is because you need space for purpose living. And so as children of the Most High, we all have something in life that we are called to do. Something in life, a place where we flow in life, a place where we just flow in the things of God, a place where we get to service other people by doing whatever that operation is. And a lot of times when you haven't set boundaries, now people's lives are crossing over into your lives, and you don't leave that space for you to explore purpose. You don't leave that place for you to pursue purpose. You don't leave that place for you to clearly hear about purpose. There's a book called Boundaries by Doctors Cloud and Townsend. And there's a quote in here that they put, and I'm going to read this to you. And it says, boundaries define us. They define what is me and what is not me. A boundary shows me where I end and someone else begins, leading me to a sense of ownership. See, when we set boundaries, we take ownership of our lives, because if I set this boundary, now I live according to this boundary. Now I live according to the standard that is set for my life, and I do not go underneath that standard. So in saying that, what they're saying in this quote here is that when you have boundaries, you clearly define who you are, and you know where that ends, and you know where the next person begins. But when you don't have boundaries, it's so easy to get clouded by what others are doing. It's so easy to get clouded by what others are thinking that you really sometimes lose yourself in the whole entire process. It's like being in a marital relationship and you lose your identity in the other person to the point that you don't even recognize your own self anymore. It's because you did not establish boundaries. It is because you did not define who you are and where you started and where you end, and then recognize where the other person began. And so I put here, we don't like anyone thinking that they own us. And so most of us, we don't like to be thought of as property or anything like that. Well, when you don't set boundaries, you allow somebody to take ownership of your life. You allow somebody to say, I'm going to tell you what to do with your life. And so we most of the time don't like that. So we need to define it so we can take ownership. The last thing here I put here is that you may be in a place where you say, well, I don't really know myself fully, so I cannot necessarily define the lines. But let me tell you the beautiful thing about boundaries. They can be moved at any time. So as you grow, as you mature, as you learn more about you, those boundaries are going to change. Likely, sometimes in our earlier ages, our boundaries are wide open. But as we learn more about ourselves, they become more and more closed in. Not that we're closed in to the point that we can't experience things, that we can't live things, that we can't know things, but they become more closed in because they become more defined. And so therefore our boundaries change. And the thing about this is that as you define your boundaries, it enables you to have a better quality of life, clearly defined about who you are and where you're going and what you're going to do, willing to let in. And there's three things that I want to leave you with today. And that is, number one, as you begin to define boundaries, especially if you're dealing with someone that you've never put boundaries on, you've always allowed them to just come in your life and do whatever they want. They may not respond in the greatest manner, and a lot of times it'll come with what seems like threats. Don't allow threats to make you retreat back and say, okay, I'm going to erase the boundary because I don't want you to feel that way. I want you to know that your boundaries demonstrate love for yourself, self-care. And then secondly, it demonstrates love for them because you want them to know who you really are and you want them to be their own selves. So it's a love thing in there. And also because a lot of times when we have allowed people to come over into our lives and flood us with their thought process, cross so many boundaries, even though sometimes we're not saying anything, in our mind, in our hearts, we're saying things, we're feeling things, and that's impacting our relationship with that person. So when I can be clear, when I can be open, when I can be truthful with you, when I can be myself, it's when we're going to have the best relationship. The next thing is define and know it's a continuous process. So like I said, those boundaries can be moved at any time. So know that you're growing, know that you're maturing, know that you're changing, know that life will change you, and those boundaries will be changed. Don't get so stuck in what you define that you don't know when it's time to shift. The last thing is never apologize for setting boundaries. So when you set boundaries, don't follow it up with a long soliloquy about why you're this way or why you feel this way or why you think this way. Set your boundaries, define them. When necessary, reiterate them. When necessary, tell the person, this is my line. I don't cross this line. I don't do that. And never apologize for it. Never feel like you've got to give a big excuse for it. Just embrace who you are at the end of the day. And so if you've got boundaries, I encourage you to revisit them as necessary. And if you don't have any boundaries, I encourage you today to clearly define who you are. Set the boundaries, because until you set the boundaries, you're probably likely being defined by everyone else. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation about positive living via simple truths and that you will tune in with me next time. Thank you and have a good night.